In this video, I'm going to be taking the JavaScript Promise API and completely re-implementing the entire thing. And this is a great project because it first of all ensures you understand how promises work, and secondly, it's a pretty challenging project as well. And also, most importantly, this is something you're going to commonly get asked in interviews. They're going to ask you to implement some type of feature built into the language or a different framework, and promises are one of the hardest things to implement, so if you know how to do this, you're going to be able to do pretty much anything they ask you. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And in this video, we're going to be fully implementing the Promise API, and that includes everything. We have .then, catch, finally, and then all of the different static methods on promises. We're going to be implementing all of them. And to make this easier for us, what I've done is I've created a test file, which you can go and download from the GitHub linked in the description below. And this test file has two ways you can run it. You can run it one by using the default promise implementation, and as you can see, all of our tests are passing. Or you can pass in your own custom promise implementation by uncommenting this line. We hit save, and now you can see all of our tests are failing because right now this file is just completely empty. So this test file is going to be really great so we can really easily see if the code that we're writing actually works, because all of these tests are going to test for those situations. And we already know for the default promise implementation, all of them pass. So we should be able to get all of these tests passing. Now to get started, the very first thing that we're going to want to do is just uncomment this line so we're actually running our own custom code, and then we can go into that mypromise.js. And what I want to do inside of here is create a class, which we're just going to call mypromise. And this mypromise class is going to be the class that contains all of our promise related code. And then I want to export this at the bottom, so we'll say module exports equals mypromise. Now if we save, we're at least exporting this mypromise class out, and we can actually use that inside of our mypromisetest.js file. So with promises, the most common thing you're going to think of is you have a promise. We're going to run it like this. You'll say new promise, and this new promise takes a function which has a resolve and a reject callback in it. That's essentially how you create a promise. So we know in order to create a promise, we give it a constructor, and this constructor is going to take in a callback, which is this function here we're passing to it. This is our callback. So we're passing a callback into our function, and then we need to use that callback where we either call the resolve or reject portion of it. Now inside this constructor, we know we need to call this callback because every time you create a promise, it calls the function you pass to it right away. And we need to pass it essentially two different functions, one for success and one for failure. So we're going to have like an onSuccess method, and we're going to have an onFail method, for example. And we actually want to wrap this inside of a try catch, because another interesting thing about promises is if you have an error at any point inside your promise, it's going to catch that error, and it's just going to call the fail method, which in our case is onFail, with that error. So this right here is kind of like resolve, and this right here is kind of like our reject, if you can think about it that way. And then we can create those methods. So we can have like onSuccess and onFail. So let's do an onSuccess here. And we're going to have an onFail just like that. And both of these are going to take in a value. So let's just put a value in there. So now the next step is to think about what happens when we have a success or a failure. Well, we know that when we have a normal promise, so let's just say here we have like const p equals new promise, we would come in here and we'd say like p.then, and we would put a function inside of here. And this then function would run anytime the promise was successful. Or we could put a .catch onto here, and this .catch is going to be ran whenever we have some type of error. So we need to implement a then and a catch method. But one thing that you'll notice about promises is if I say p dot, you'll see the only methods we have available are catch, finally, and then. So all of these other methods, for example, onSuccess and onFail, we want to make sure that these are private methods so that they're not available outside this class. So we're just going to implement those as private methods. So we just need to use this pound symbol here. And that's going to make sure that they're not accessible anywhere else except for inside our promise class. So when we try to call something on our promise, we don't see those additional methods. So now we need to implement like a then, a catch, and a finally. So let's start out by just doing a .then, because that's going to be the easiest thing to implement. We can just say .then here, and this is going to take in a callback, because when you call .then on a promise, you pass it a function. So that's where that .then comes from. And what we need to do is we need to save that .then somewhere, and then when we have a success, we call onSuccess, and we're going to call whatever we pass to this then method here. So the way that we're going to do this is actually going to be really straightforward. All we're going to do is we're just going to save this callback to an array, because we could call .then multiple times on the same promise. For example, we could say p.then, and then p.then, and we're going to save two different callbacks that run on success. So we need to make sure we just save this to an array of successful callbacks, for example. So inside of here, all we're going to do is we're just going to say, you know what? Whoops, not an onSuccess. I'm sorry. Inside of then, we want to save this callback. So we can say, for example, we could call these then callbacks. And what I want to do is make sure this is private again. So we can say, we're going to add to this array the callback that we get passed in. So every time we call that then, we're just saving the callback that we get passed to it, and then we're going to call that later in our onSuccess method. And then we just need to make sure we define that callback, this then callbacks, to be an empty array to start out with. That way it starts out as an empty array and we're just continually adding new things to that array every single time we call .then. So if we call .then, pass it a function, it gets saved in this array. Then when we call onSuccess, we need to call that array essentially. We need to call all the functions in that array with the value that we have right here. So in order to make it easier to understand exactly how this is working, we want to store some state inside of our promise because normal promises keep track of the value that is resolved, so the value that gets passed to onSuccess or onFail. They keep track of the state you're in, so if you're pending, fulfilled, which is success, or if you're rejected, which is failed. So we need to keep track of all that information. So we're just going to have some state variables here. So our first variable is going to be for the state that we're in. This is going to be like pending, rejected, fulfilled, and so on. And we're also going to have a value variable which contains the value from our onSuccess or our onFail. So we could say, for example, here that our value is set equal to that value. We want to do that both in the fail and success state. Then we can take our state and we want to set that to the correct state. So what I'm going to do to make state a little bit easier to work with is I'm just going to create a constant variable called state. And inside of this state variable, we're going to have our different states. So we're going to have fulfilled, and that's just equal to fulfilled. Copy this down a couple times because we're also going to have rejected. And we're going to have pending. And this is going to say rejected pending. I'm going to make this lowercase. There we go. There we go. And then we can just down here in our state, we can say that is equal to state dot, oops, all caps, state dot fulfilled. And then here on our fail, we can say that our state is equal to rejected. And when we start out, our state is going to be equal to pending. So when we first create our promise, it's going to be pending by default, and it's not going to become fulfilled or rejected until we call either onSuccess or onFail. And these are methods that we only call from our promise. So for example, come back to here where we have our resolve and our reject. These are essentially our success and fail callbacks. And inside of here, we're going to do some code. So we're going to have some code, and then eventually we're going to call either resolve with some type of value passed to it, for example, hi, or we're going to call reject with, some kind of error passed to it. This is how our code is going to work for our promise. So we're passing it these callbacks, and at some point in the future, these callbacks are going to get called. So when we call these callbacks, what we want to do is we need to make sure we set our values and we need to set our state. But we only want to do this one time. If, for example, we call resolve and we call resolve a second and a third and a fourth time, only the first time you call resolve would actually do anything. So we want to have just a simple check here where we say, hey, you know what? If our state is equal to, or I'm sorry, not equal to the pending state, then we know that we have called this method in the past, so we just want to return, because if our state is not pending, we can't do anything on success. It means we called resolve or reject multiple times. Same thing with onFail. If our state is not equal to pending, just return immediately and don't do anything. Now with that done, all we need to do is actually make sure we run all these callbacks that we've been saving inside of .then, catch, and finally. So what we can do for that is we're just going to create another function. We're going to call this run callbacks. And this function, all it's going to do is just run all the callbacks. And the reason I'm putting in this own function is because we're going to do the same thing inside of onSuccess. So I'm going to say this dot run callbacks. We're going to do the exact same thing in onFail. So it just allows me to put all this code in essentially one single place. So inside this run callbacks, first I want to see what state we're in. Because if we're in the success state, so if our state is equal to state dot fulfilled, well then we want to run all of the callbacks for the .then. Otherwise, if we're in a different state, for example, if we're in the failure state, so if we come down here and we say our state is equal to state.rejected, then we want to run all of the catch callbacks, which we can define up here as just an empty array for now. And we'll implement the catch function in just a little bit. So if we're successful, and run all the thens. If we're failed, run all of the catches. So inside of here, we can just get all of our then callbacks. And we want to say for each one of them, we're going to get a callback. And for each one of those callbacks, I want to just call it with the value that we have saved for our promise. So our promise is saving a value in a state. And when our state is finally successful, we're going to take that value that was the successful value and call all of our .thens that we have on this. That's all we're doing, pretty straightforward. We want to do the same thing down here for our failure as well. This one is just going to be for our catch callbacks if we want to pass in that value, which in our case is most likely going to be some type of error. Now, the only other thing that we need to do in here is we just want to take our current then callbacks. So we can say then callbacks. We want to set that to an empty array. We want to do the same thing inside of here with our catch callbacks. And the reason that we're doing this is because, okay, let's say that we have a couple .thens that we add. We call .then twice on this, promise. And then in here, we call both those .thens. If we don't reset this, Then if we call the run callbacks function in the future, it's going to run those callbacks we've already called. So every time that we call a callback, we want to essentially remove it from our list of callbacks so that it no longer can be called anymore. That's all this code is going to do. And the reason for this is, let's say you have a promise and this promise returns after 500 milliseconds, it resolves after 500 milliseconds. And in my code, I add a dot then, and then like a minute later, I add another dot then. Well, this dot then, when it gets added, is going to run all my callbacks, and it's going to run this new callback I added. And since this old callback was already ran, I want to make sure that's removed so it doesn't get re-ran again. So the way that we actually run these callbacks is inside dot then. We want to make sure we call the run callbacks function. Now, the reason that I'm doing this is because sometimes when you call dot then on a promise, the promise has already finished resolving. This onSuccess method right here has already been called. So we want to make sure that we don't wait for that to get called. Since it's already been called, our state is already not pending. We want to just make sure we immediately run the callback. Now, if we just save this real quick, we can look over here and we actually have 3 tests that are passing just with this really simple amount of code right here. And if we scroll up, we can kind of see which those tests are. You can see we have dot then with no chaining is passing properly. We have it passing multiple thens. So that's because we're using this array right here. Since we're using an array, we have the multiple thens catch being done here, and we have it working when we have a dot then and a dot catch, but we don't have anything working with chaining. Chaining is the next big step, and that's because when you have a promise, you can say, for example, p dot then, and then do another dot then, and then do another dot then, add a catch onto here. You can do all of this really complicated stuff with promises, but right now we're not dealing with any chaining because our dot then doesn't actually return anything. Right here, we would need to come in at the bottom, and we would need to return some type of new promise right here, and that new promise would handle all of our chaining. Also, we don't have anything for catch or finally implemented, so before we worry about chaining, because that's going to be by far the most complicated part of this video, what I want to focus on is dot catch and dot finally, because they're really easy to implement. They're essentially just simpler versions of dot then. So we're coming here with our catch, which takes in a callback, and we're going to come in with finally, which also takes in a callback. So the catch function is essentially exactly the same as the then function. We're just adding it to this catch callbacks instead. And something interesting about the catch, or the then function, is that in then you can actually pass multiple callbacks. You can pass a catch callback and you can pass a then callback. So let me just show you how this works. What you'd do inside of here, you'd pass in one callback and then you would pass in another callback. And the first callback that you pass would be for success, and the second one would be for failure. So this is a situation we need to make sure we handle. And by doing that, it makes implementing these two functions dead simple, since we can just call dot then. So right here, we can say, you know what, if we have a then callback, so if it's not equal to null, then we want to add it. Same exact thing for our catch. So if we have the catch callback, we want to add the catch callback, and if we have the then callback, we want to add the then callback. That's really straightforward right there. And if we just scroll down to the bottom here, we can make sure that all of our tests are still passing. We now have 6 tests that are passing just by doing that really simple thing right there. Now for catch, what we want to do is we want to make sure that our catch works. So for catch to work, all we're going to do is call then. So we're going to say this dot then. We're going to pass it nothing for our then callback, and we're going to pass it the callback pass to catch as the catch version. And that's going to make that catch section work. So now before we actually go on and implement this finally function, what I want to work on is chaining, because that'll make this finally function a bit easier to work with. And the first thing we need to do when it comes to chaining, let me just get rid of all that extra code at the bottom there, is we need to make sure that we handle our this properly. So when we pass this dot onSuccess to our callback in this type of format, it actually doesn't properly bind this. So our this keyword is going to be messed up. And when we start to deal with chaining, that's going to be a real issue. So instead, what we need to do is we're going to create an onSuccess success binded variable. And this is just going to be our onSuccess function, but we're just going to make sure we properly bind this. So now we have our onSuccess. We'll just call it onSuccess bind. We can do that right here. We're going to do the same exact thing with onFail. Let me just copy this. We're going to have onFail bind here. This is going to be onFail. Now all this does, like I said, is properly hook up our this by binding this to the thing properly. So that way inside of this function for onSuccess right down here, if we use the word this, for example, it's going to make sure that this keyword is properly hooked up. And it's going to help a lot, especially when we start to deal with chaining. So now we are finally ready for the most complex part by far of this video, and that's making this dot then actually chainable. Now to make this chainable, what we need to do is return a new promise. So at the very top, we just want to return a new my promise, and that's because that's what we called our class. And this we know is a function that takes in resolve and reject, just like that. So all of our code is going to go inside this new promise. And this new promise is going to allow us to do chaining because our .then returns a promise, which we can call .then on, which returns a promise, and so on. So we can do infinite chaining essentially, which is the whole reason we're returning this promise here. Now what we need to do inside this promise is make sure we handle all these extra resolves and rejects properly. So inside here, we need to essentially add our callbacks, but we're going to do this a little bit differently. Instead of conditionally adding our callback, we're always going to add a callback, but the callback is going to be different things depending on if we defined one or not. So first I'm going to come up here and say our then callbacks. I'm going to push in a new callback, which is going to take in a result variable. And this result variable is, for example, if we called the resolve function and passed in high, that's what that variable is going to be. It's going to be that high result we get passed in. And what I want to do is say, hey, you know what? If we have a then callback passed in, if that is equal to null, so we don't actually have any value here, what I want to do is I want to call the resolve version of this function, and I want to pass in our result, and then I want to return and do nothing else at all. The reason that we have this code is, let's say that we create a promise. So we've created a promise and we call .then, for example, and then we call .catch, and then we call .then again. What this does is, let's say our promise is successful. So it's going to call .then, and then that one is successful. So it's going to call this .then again. Well, the way that our code works is we call .then, and what that's going to do is it's going to return to us a new promise. And right now we're just kind of skipping this step. Then what we're going to do is we're going to call .catch, and .catch does not have a then callback. This is being passed in as undefined. So this section right here is going to run, and we're just going to immediately resolve. And the reason we're doing this is because .catch doesn't care what happens on success. So we're essentially saying, hey, skip this completely. That's what this code does, is saying, hey, you know what? If this callback doesn't care about what happens on success, we're just going to skip this promise and move on to the next promise, which is what happens when we call resolve, because we're resolving the next promise passed in. Otherwise, if we do have a callback, then we actually want to care about that callback and handle that callback itself. So what we can do is do that. So we're going to wrap this in a try catch, and we're doing this just because in promises, like I said, if you have an error, it's going to catch that error and it's going to reject. So if we have an error, make sure we automatically reject. So that means if we're inside this .then and it throws an error, it's going to go straight into this .catch. That's what this little bit of code right here does. Otherwise, inside of here, if we have that callback, hey, I want to use that callback with the result, and then I want to call the next thing in line with that callback. So I want to resolve this new promise that we created with the result of this previous promise that we just called. Now, the reason for this is because if you have a promise and you call .then on that promise and you return some value inside of here, for example, we return high, well, that return value is going to get passed to the next promise that you have. That's how promise chaining works. If you return one value from one promise, it's going to move into the next promise. So that's all this does. It says if you return a value, pass that value on. Now, the nice thing about having .then and .catch being very similar is this code is almost identical for .catch. So I'm just going to copy this down, and we're going to just replace .then with .catch for pretty much all instances. So if our catch callback is equal to null, then what I want to do here is just reject. I'm saying, hey, you know what? If I don't care about catching a promise, just move on to the next promise with this current result. Just don't do anything. Otherwise, I'm going to call this catch callback, and if it returns successfully, then we're going to move on to the resolve. Otherwise, we're going to reject. And that's it. That's all we need to do to make this essentially work with chaining. And now if I just give this a quick save here, you're going to see it's going to mostly work. And if we come over here, we have 10 passing tests, but if we scroll up, we're still going to have plenty of tests that aren't working. Like, it looks like a lot of these tests are working, but some of them aren't quite working as we would expect. And that's because we're not handling what happens when we return promises from promises and how exactly that works as a value. Because with promises, what you can do is we can say like dot then, and inside this then, we could return a new promise, for example. And this new promise would then be handled by our next .then. Otherwise, if we return just like a string, for example, with high, that is going to get turned into a promise and then it's going to be passed to our .then. So we need to be able to handle both values and promises inside of our success methods. So what we need to do is come up here into onSuccess and onFail and deal with what happens if our value is a promise, because we can actually pass in a value as the return result. So inside here, before we do anything at all, I want to do a simple check that says, hey, you know what? If our value is an instance of my promise, well, then that means that we are dealing with a promise here. So what I want to do is I want to take our value.then, and inside our value.then, I want to call my onSuccess method that we binded, and I want to call my onFail method that we have binded. And then I just want to return. Now, the reason that we're doing this again is because if we have a promise being returned from another promise, we need to wait for that promise to resolve, and then we finish up and call the success or fail method based on that promise's results. That's again just how promises work in JavaScript. And if you're not really familiar with promises at all, or maybe you have some gaps in promises, I have a full video covering them. I'll link in the cards and description for you. It'll make understanding some of these more minute points a lot easier. So we're going to copy this into our onFail as well, because we want to do the exact same thing. If we have a promise, make sure we wait for that promise to finish before we actually call the rest of our code. So if we just save there, that's going to help with a few more of our tests actually working properly. Another thing to make sure we understand about promises is promises actually always happen asynchronously. Even if the result returns immediately, they actually happen asynchronously. And by far the easiest way to make something async is we could just do a simple set timeout, and we could make our set timeout be 0. So if we had a set timeout here with a timeout of 0, that's going to happen at the very next possible time that it can, because we set this to 0, but it's going to make sure that it's asynchronous. But promises are a bit different. Promises actually execute way before a set timeout ever would, but it's still asynchronous. The way we can do that is by calling a function called queueMicrotask. This is going to queue something that's going to run essentially at the exact same time a promise would run. It's going to be as quick as possible, but it's going to be delayed. It's going to wait at least until the current code is done executing before running this promise. This is really important that we have this implementation, because this is how promises work. They queue things into this job system, which is called microtasks. So whenever we succeed or fail, we need to make sure that we don't actually execute the code immediately, and that we wait just a microsecond, this might be like 10 milliseconds or whatever, for the current code to finish before we run these onSuccess callbacks. Now with that out of the way, we have a lot of our chaining stuff done. We just need to go down to our catch, make sure we return from this, because in our .then we're returning. We need to return the result from our .catch, and then we can finally implement finally, because right now it's just returning nothing at all, so it's clearly not working like we expect. To make this work, all we need to do is essentially call this .then, and you may think we just pass in the callback for both of these, but finally is a bit weird in that finally doesn't actually take in any result. Normally, when you do this .then, this would get passed the value that we save instead of our state, but the finally promise never gets any value passed to it. So we need to make this a little bit different. We're going to make both of these callbacks that's going to take in our result, and all I want to do is call the callback, but don't pass the value to it. And then I want to return our results so that it gets chained onto our further promises. So let's imagine we have a promise, p.then, and then let's say we have like a .finally, and then we have another .then that comes after that. Well, inside of this .then, if we return a result, it's never going to get passed to this finally. It'll get passed to the next then in line. So the way that this code works is we're saying, you know what? Don't pass the result to our callback. Skip it, and instead return that result, which means it'll get passed to the next callback in line, which is our .then. So this little bit of code is just ensuring that our callback takes the value that gets passed into it, ignores it, and passes it on to the next part of the promise, because finally can never take a result. And we want to do essentially the exact same thing for if we have a failure. The main difference here is instead of returning, we want to make sure we throw this result as an error. And that's because inside of here, if we have our function running and we call the reject method, that means we're rejecting with some type of error. So we want to throw that error so it's going to get picked up inside of the next .catch that we have after our finally. Now, if we save this, get rid of this little code right here, you're going to see inside of our test suite, we now have 10 tests passing, and it looks like every single test for then, catch, finally is working, which is exactly what we expect. Now, one thing that our tests are not actually taking into account, but is something you want to make sure you understand, is if you have a promise that essentially is not handled. So let's say you have a promise, we're going to say new promise, and inside this promise, there's some type of error. You have some bad code that returns an error, but you never actually put a .catch on your promise. Your code inside of JavaScript is going to throw an error saying, hey, you know what? You had an error, but your promise never actually caught that error, so you have to deal with this somehow. We need to make sure we replicate this as well, and this is actually pretty easy to do. The way we can check to see if we have a .catch callback is we can go up into our onFail, and we can just check if we have any of those callbacks. We can check our catch callback's length, and if this length is equal to 0, then that means that we have an error, but we have no catch that is catching that error. So that means that we have a problem, and we should throw an error. And we're going to throw a new error, and we're going to call this an uncaught promise error, and we're going to pass it in the value. That way it's passed along with our error. And what we can do down here is just create that class, which we called uncaught promise error, and we're going to make this extend the error class. Now, in order to make this work, all you do is you just take a constructor, you pass it in the value, and you're just going to call the constructor with that value. So we're just going to call the error class super method with that. And then we're just going to take our stack. And all I'm going to do here essentially is just add on a super simple message. And this message is just going to say in promise. and then we're going to put our error stack back on there. I'm going to take the current stack and just append this message to the very beginning of it. And this is exactly how promises work inside of JavaScript. If you don't actually catch the error, it's just going to say, hey, in promise, and then it's going to show you the error. And it's going to say uncaught, in promise, and then show you the error. That way you know, hey, you know what? This promise was not properly caught, and here's the actual stack trace for where this error occurred. That's all this little bit of code is doing. Technically, you don't need this, but in order to make our promises work exactly the same as the promises in JavaScript, this is going to be crucial. So now with that done, we have that final section done, and we have essentially all of these different methods implemented, and all we have left to do is actually focus on all of the static methods, because if we go over here in the static methods section, you can see all the static methods for promises, and these are really fun to implement. Now the first two I want to talk about are resolve and reject, because they are dead simple to implement. All we need to do is just come down here. We can take a static method, so we can say static resolve, and in this resolve method, we're going to take a value. And all this is going to do is just return to us a new promise that automatically resolves to that value. So it's going to take in a resolve here, and we're just going to call it resolve with that value. That's all that this does. And reject is just as easy, but it's just going to call the reject method instead. So we're going to call reject on this one instead. So now if we save and we look over here, scroll down, you see we have 12 tests passing, and that includes both our resolve and our reject test. These are about the easiest methods that you can implement for promises. Now we have a few more complicated methods. For example, all settled, race, and any. So let's start with all first. We're going to come down here, static all, and this all method takes in essentially an array of promises. So we have an array of promises right here, and this works like this. We'll say promise.all, and we pass it in like p1, p2, p3, and then we're going to have a dot then, and this dot then is going to get called as soon as all the promises finish, and it's going to pass us an array of results, which are going to be like this: value 1, value 2, and value 3. So it's going to be all the values from our promises. Otherwise, if we have a single error in any of our promises, then the dot catch is going to be with that error. So that's how our promise all is going to work. So in order to implement that, we essentially need to run all of our promises and save all the results from them. And if all of them successfully complete, then we return essentially the results of all of them. Otherwise, if any of them fail, we return that failure. And we need to make sure we actually return a promise from this. So we're going to make sure we return a new promise, which we're going to call my promise. And that's going to take in resolve and reject, just like this. And our resolve method gets called with all of the values. So we need to store all those values inside of an array such as results. Also, I'm going to keep a count of how many promises we have completed. So we're going to say completed promises starts at 0. And that's because as soon as we've finished completing all the promises, then we resolve. And we don't resolve until we've finished every single promise. So for each one of our promises, let's loop through. So you can say for let I equals, for let I equals 0, I is less than promises.length and I++. So we're just looping through each one of our promises. What I want to do is get our promise, which is promises of I here. And then I can say we want to do promise.then, which is going to take in a value. And then we can also have a catch inside of here. And the catch is just going to call reject. And this may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but the reason is because if any of our promises fail, we just want to take the first one that fails and immediately call .catch with that result. That's how all works. But for our .then, we want to wait for all of our promises to succeed before we call this resolve. So what I want to do is I'm going to take our completed promises and add one to that. I'm also going to take our result at the ith position in that array. I'm going to set it equal to the value. So what this does is it's saying, hey, whenever a promise finishes, whichever one it is in the array, set the result at the same position in our results array. Then what I want to do is I want to say, you know what, if we've completed all of our promises, so if our completed promises is the same as our promises.length, we've completed all of them, then I want to send out the value. Otherwise, if we haven't completed them all, just wait. And that's how this function is going to work. And we want to make sure this says results here because we're returning all of the results. And this should also say results. Now let's save and see if that actually worked. Scroll up a little ways, and you can see all has worked perfectly. We can say with success and with fail. So both cases for all have worked. Now we can move on to, for example, all settled. Let's do that one next. Static all settled, and this takes in an array of promises as well. Now, unlike the all method, all settled is a bit different because it waits for every promise to finish and it waits for it to either succeed or fail. It doesn't matter what it does, and then it's going to save those results. So for example, we're going to have each promise return a result that has a status, which is either going to be fulfilled or it's going to be rejected, depending on if it was a success or a failure. And also it's going to have either a value or a reason, which is going to determine what the value is if it was successful or the reason that it failed. So every single promise is going to return this type of information. So we're going to have a very similar format to what we had for all. So I'm just going to copy all of this code here. I'm going to paste it into all settled. We're going to have results. We're going to have the number of promises that have completed, and we're going to loop through all of our promises. And for each one, we want to have a dot then, a dot catch, and also a dot finally, just like this. So inside of our dot then, what we want to do is we want to take our results in that ith position, and we want to say, you know what? Our status here is our state dot fulfilled, and our value is just going to be our value. So we can just pass it in like that. For our catch, we can have our reason here. I'm going to paste that down, and this is going to be our reason, and this is going to be rejected. So if we have a successful promise, it's going to have a status of fulfilled and a value. And if we have a failed promise, it's going to have a status of rejected, and it's going to pass along a reason. Now the reason how we have this finally here is I want to take our completed promises number, I want to increment it, and then I just want to check if our completed promises is equal to our promises.length. That means we finished all the promises, and we can resolve with all of our results. Now you will notice we're never using this reject method anywhere, and that's because all settled never ever rejects. It's always going to be successful. So that's why we're only ever doing resolve here. Let's save this and see if this worked inside of our code. We'll just scroll down here, scroll up, and you can see now that all settled test has passed, so we know that this code is working as we expect. All we have left is the race and the any method. Let's just minimize this down. We're going to come in here with a static race method, which takes in promises. Now race is very easy to implement because all it does is it takes the first promise that either succeeds or fails, and it just returns that. It doesn't care about saving all the promises, it just takes the first one, and that's all it deals with. So we want to return a new my promise, just like we've been doing before, with a resolve and a reject. I'm going to take all my promises, just loop through each one of them. We have each promise here. And for each promise, what I want to do is I want to add a dot then, which calls resolve. And I want to call the dot catch, which takes in a reject. That's it. It's super simple because we just take the first one that finishes and we call the method for it, and we just ignore all of the rest. So that right there is going to be all we need to do for race. If we scroll down here, you can see now race is successful. Now we can move on to our final method here, which is any, which takes in promises. And any works very similar to race. It just returns the first one that succeeds, but it doesn't return on failure unless every single promise passed to it fails. Then it's going to return on failure. So what I want to do, this is going to be quite similar to all. So we're going to start with this all right here. I'm just going to copy that and paste it down. And that's because it works just like all, but in reverse. If anything succeeds, it finishes, but it waits for all of them to fail before it passes out the failures. So we're going to have our results. In our case, we're going to call this errors. And then we're also going to have our completed promises, which in our case is just the rejected promises. Then we're going to loop through all of our different promises. And if any of them succeed, for our dot then, we call resolve. So this is going to be like our dot catch. Otherwise, if we have a failure, then what we need to do is we need to take that value and we need to actually save this inside of our rejected promises array. So we're going to take our rejected promises, add one, take our errors, add to that ith position, and we're going to add in that value there. And then if our rejected promises is equal to our promises dot length, this means that every single promise that we have passed to any has failed. Then what we want to do is throw an error saying that we had that failure. So we're going to reject with an error, and this is going to use a new aggregate error. And this is the error that is thrown by the normal promise implementation. It passes in all of the errors, and then a simple message that just says all promises were rejected, just like that. Now if we save, we come over here, you can see every single one of our tests are passing. Now this is a really difficult project, so hopefully you didn't feel too overwhelmed, but if you did, I'd highly recommend checking out my JavaScript Simplified course. It's linked down below. This course takes you through all the different concepts of JavaScript that you need to understand to go from an absolute beginner to an advanced developer, and that's going to make dealing with projects like this so much easier. So I would highly recommend you check that out, link below. And with that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.